So this is our final subject in Unit 1, last week, week 4, and it's going to be about echo walls and the perfusion of those walls of the heart, and in particular ventricular perfusion, ventricular segmental perfusion. If you're looking at this, or you're trying to figure out where this information comes from, the PowerPoints and all of that, my primary source of all the information in the PowerPoints is the ASE, and you see two guideline sources on this page here, where heart chamber quantification on the bottom and how to perform a comprehensive transthoracic echo at the top in yellow. And all this information comes from one of those two sources. So if we're looking at, and I might add that if you want to read something in Auto or the Equifax book, then you would go to Brightspace, and I posted in this unit in this class, I should say, what information pertains to what we're studying now and where it is in those two sources. So what we're really going to be looking at is the where the where the coronary perfusion territories are based on the echo images and angles that we get of the heart while we're doing echoes. It looks like a fairly complicated picture here, but it has all of our angle views in there, and it also has this bullseye view to show the whole left ventricle primarily, and where the ventricular segments are, how they're broken down, and what coronary arteries perfuse those particular segments. And you can see those are colored in green and so on and so forth. I know this isn't the easiest slide to see, but we're going to break this down for you, so don't be too concerned about that. We have different, as you guys are learning now, different transducer positioning models to see different areas of the heart, where it shows here parasternal this way, apical kind of down this way, or looking up at the heart this way, and suprasternal kind of looking down at the heart through the aorta. Then you see the shorts and all of that, different subcostal cuts and subcostal cut here and apical cuts here, and this is just giving us an idea of the transducer position and how we see those those heart segments. And then if you start, as far as perfusion is concerned, we're talking about the left ventricle in the beginning here, and we showed this image earlier on in circulation and how the left ventricle is perfused by the diagonals and marginal arteries and so on and so forth with the circ and LAD, how they break off from the left main. This is just a picture showing the overlying. If you were to take the circulatory system and remove it from the heart, it would look something like this right here, coming off the aorta and the sinuses above Valsalva and so on and so forth, with the right and left cusps, and how the blood has traveled down through these different marginals and acute marginals and diagonals and so on and so forth. So if you're start just looking right at the left ventricle, we'll look at our views and how those views, what the perfusion territories are for those particular views. So if you're looking at just the left ventricle, again, this looks familiar. And let's go into for example, the parasternal long axis view, parasternal short axis view, apical 4, apical 2, and apical long. And you can see that in these views, there's different colors that match to the coronary territory that is perfused based on the color. For example, in the parasternal long axis view, we have these walls here and these walls here, and these walls are going to be broken down. We're going to talk about that. And you can see here the green is associated with the left anterior descending artery, whereas this infralateral view down here, this is considered anterior septum, is considered infralateral, and that is primarily served by either the right coronary artery or the circumflex artery, and so on and so forth for each view, and we're going to discuss in that more detail here. So this is our parasternal long axis view, and everybody should be familiar with this view by now. I know it's not the easiest one to get, and none of them are, but let's move this back up here for you. Peristernal long axis view. We all know how we're going to be positioning our transducer to get that. And I just want to quickly reiterate the positioning of the transducer. If you notice, I pointed out in a couple of classes, we have an index marker on our transducer. That index marker in echo, we have an orientation. In each view, we have to place an index marker in a certain position to see the heart in its proper orientation in relation to what has been prescribed for echocardiography throughout the world. So the ASC developed these guidelines, and that index marker is on there for a reason. And if you notice on our screen when we do echoes, I think I pointed this out to some people in the class, our index marker is corresponding to a marker on the screen. And that screen marker is on the right side of our screen if we're looking at it on the screen. It's usually on the newer machines, it usually has a P up there on the right side of the screen at the very top. And our index marker corresponds to that. Anything our index marker is pointing to shows up on that side of the screen, the right side of the screen. So orientation is important because you can turn that transducer around and get an image. And everything you need is in that image, but it's not oriented correctly on the screen, and it could confuse somebody. And echo is really unique in this because the heart is turned around, flipped upside down, all that stuff, backwards, whatever you want to call it. The index marker is on the right side of the screen. If you were to do general ultrasound and the index marker, the marker on the screen would be on the left side of the screen, and the index marker would have to align with that. And that's because of the orientation of the human body, left and right. When you do a general ultrasound on a patient, you're oriented to the body and what's on the right, what's on the left. The heart's different. The heart sits in the body differently. So the index marker corresponds in cardiac sonography completely opposite. The index marker is placed and corresponds to completely opposite it does in general ultrasound. Now just remember that. So here we are in the peristernal long axis view. We all know how to get this by now. And the coronary artery territories for the peristernal long axis view are, as I depict right here. And you can see right here we have different segments of the heart. This here is the anterior septum. There's also a posterior septum of the heart. This is the anterior part of the septum in the peristernal long axis view. And it's broken down to the basal anterior septum, as you can see here, these segments. Mid-anterior septum, you can see here. And then you have the apex of the heart over here, which is still supplied by this green box, the left anterior descending artery. You see that comes right around to the apex. And then after that, you'll have what we call the infralateral portion of the heart in this view. And you'll have the mid-infralateral, which is basically the middle part, as the mid-anterior septum is here, and the basal infralateral, which is at the base of the heart. So you can see we have basal segments, mid segments, and apical segments of the heart. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go. And you can see that's the coronary territories that are associated with each segment over here. So in the peristernal long axis view, that's what we're seeing as far as coronary artery innervation and what supplies that particular area of the heart. If you look at the peristernal short axis view, in here we're going to see different segments of the walls. The peristernal short axis view will have, I'll show you those segments here. We're going to have it. Peristernal short axis view is right up here. We're going to have an anterior segment. We're going to have an anterolateral segment, an infralateral segment, an inferior segment, an inferior septal segment, and an anterior septal segment. We see all of the coronary territories in the peristernal short-axis view of the heart. And again, if we refer to our graph over here, we see green, LAD, primarily in the septal portion here. We have the septal portion. You can see it kind of changes down here a little bit. We go into the blue, RCA, and the inferior septum of the heart. And then you can see it goes to the inferior, which is fed by the RCA, that's blue. Then it goes back to the infralateral portion over here. Remember, this is mid-infralateral over here, infralateral over here. And infralateral is either fed by the circ or the RCA. And then we have the anterolateral segment, which is either going to be fed by the LAD or the circ. Okay, so all these are defined. So our heart segment walls, once again, here are the anterior septum, inferior septum, inferior, infralateral, anterolateral. If you move on to the apical four-chamber view, and here we have our apical four. In that view there, we have our apical cap. And this is going to be probably the 17 segment model of the heart, and I'll explain that in a minute. Apical lateral, mid-anterior lateral over here, basal anterolateral, apical septum, see that's attached kind of to the apical, that's the septal area of the heart that separates the right and left sides. Mid-inferior septum. Now this is important. What you have here, when we cut through the heart, now picture the heart, if we take our slice, our ultrasound slice out of the heart, we're actually slicing down through the septum. Septum's pretty thick between the two chambers. Our slice down through there, and when we flip it up and turn it into this four-chamber view, our slice, if we're looking at this and have our orientation correctly, we slice through there correctly, we're seeing the inferior septum of the heart as opposed to the anterior septum of the heart. And this is perfused by the territories. As we've mentioned before, you can go over here and pick out your territory where the apical cap is going to be LAD, apical septum, primarily LAD. You can see the right side turns blue. It's going to be all RCA here and LAD, and a mixture of LAD and RCA down in this basal septum area here. Okay. Basal anterolateral is going to be all circ or LAD on this side here. Primarily LAD. Okay. But let's go by what they're saying here for technicality purposes. Then if we go into our apical two-chamber view, apical 2, we're going to be cutting, so the apical 4 is this cut here. It's going to be a coronal cut. This here is a sagittal cut where we're cutting right straight through the left ventricle, right from, if you took a slice of a human being right down the middle and cut the person in half from front to back. That's what we're doing with the heart. So this is the left ventricle cut in right down through the middle, and we have our apical cap, apical anterior, mid-anterior, basal anterior, apical inferior, mid-inferior, basal inferior. And once again, we can go up and see where those coronary territories are, which coronary artery supplies those particular territories. We can see RCA, we can see LAD. So that's the primary innervation for this particular cut on our LV. Then if we go to our apical 3 chamber, or what's referred to as a long axis view, we can see that right here. And we can see that we have the apical cap, apical anterior. Now, I want you to look at something as I do this. Mid-anterior septum, basal anterior septum. Look up here. Apical cap, mid-anterior septum, basal anterior septum. This is essentially the same cut as that one, just a little different angle. You have your mid-infralateral, mid-infralateral, basal infralateral, basal infralateral, and you also have the apical lateral. And here you could actually cut that down into the apical lateral up here too. Usually you just can't see it quite so well in this view, the apex part. You can see all the other walls. These walls are the same walls as they are down here. And then on our right side, we have the right ventricle here. That's supplied by the RCA. We're going to break down the right ventricular walls too. And up in this view, you can also see the RV is snuck in over here. It wraps around the OV, supplied by the RCA. The American Society of Echo breaks the heart down into 3 different segment models. Whereas, don't be concerned about the 18 segment model. What's going to more concern us is the 16 segment model. Move this down a little bit for us. And a little bit up here, just a little bit. So the 17 segment model is recommended to assess myocardial perfusion when we're performing echoes and even other imaging techniques. The 16 segment model is recommended for routine studies assessing wall motion because truly the activity of the apex and thickening are basically imperceptible. So this shows an apical segment here, but we're not going to actually be able to see the actual tip of the apex. So the 16 segment model is used for just evaluating the walls, and this here is assess myocardial perfusion and so on and so forth. The 18 segment model moves into even breaks the apex down even further. It makes it even more complicated there. But we're going to be concerned about these 2 segments, okay? This is looking at, if you look at this bullseye picture, this is looking at the LV, staring down. If you were to cut the LV like a slice of bread, and then stare right from the base, and then stare down the LV all the way down into the apex, this is how the heart would be broken down. You'd be able to look right down into it and get your different segments and the numbers of those segments. And again, you'd have anterior, anterolateral, infralateral, and this would be the basal area, basal inferior, basal inferior septal basal. Then you'd have your mid anterior septal, inferior septal, and mid anterior and mid anterolateral, and so on and so forth, right down to your apex. And these segments are numbered so that we can relate to which one is not being perfused correctly, and so on and so forth. And you can see down here we've written what the numbers correspond to. And for test purposes, I would just be concerned more about the 16 and 17 segment models, okay? This here just gives us an idea of which artery is dominating in that particular segment of the heart. You talk about the numbers here, like the anterior septal anterior, you'd see the LED dominates all the way down from the basal to the mid and to the apical segments of that particular area, whereas the circumflex would kind of dominate the side here, and the right coronary would dominate over here. So again, you're just looking right down the heart, a bullseye right down to the apex. Picture this stretched out, if you could, all the way down, and these are the different segments, as I explained before, for each different cut plane through the heart. Another way of looking at that is, this is out of the ASC2, where if you take our different 4 chamber cuts of the heart from the apex, long axis 2 and 4, and you see how these are colored red, we got green, blue here, and you see how this little arrow comes in like this right here. So if we were taking or this little line comes through here, the red, blue, and green cut down through this bullseye view of the heart, and you can kind of see how that corresponds to what we're looking at when we make that cut through the heart. This would be the two-chamber view, for example, right in the center. We're going to cut right down through the center of the heart, and we're going to be cutting through 1, 7, 11, and so on and so forth. And if you look at that, right here, 1, 7, I know they don't have 11 in there, but 13 and so on and so forth, 1, 7, and so on and so forth. But you can see how that comes right down here. It's actually, that is a 13, is it? 1, 7, 13, 17. So it goes straight down through, this particular cut goes straight down through the two-chamber view. The four-chamber view cuts down through this segment over here. And again, if you were looking at that, the four-chamber view would cut down like this segment here. And the long axis view, the red orientation will cut down through the opposite segment over here. Right down through 2, 8, 14, 17, 11, and 5, and so on and so forth. And then if you take those and just kind of follow those segments down here, see how they come down to these views and identify those for us in our four-chamber cuts, where this here will tell you you're in the four-chamber view with this cut here, four-chamber, right down to these segments here. These are the segments that are shown, 8, 9, and so on and so forth. Oh, excuse me, 3, I can't even read these things, I'm sorry, 9, and so on, so right up through this way. And the same thing here, and the same thing here. These align, all align with each other. Very poor explanation of that, but I think you get the idea. In our apical planes, if we look at our different segments here, we can see in our four-chamber view, apex, we got our lateral segment, mid-lateral, basal-lateral, our septal segments, mid-septal, basal-septal, apical septum here. And we can see the LED with that, what that covers territory-wise. We can see what the RCA covers. We can see what RCA or LED will cover in the purple here. And our two chambers, so on and so forth, our long axis, so on and so forth. Okay. So that does it for the left ventricle and the coronary territory interpretation in our cut planes and so on and so forth. So we should be okay with that. In the right ventricle, views and perfusion of the right ventricle are a little bit different. The right ventricle, first off, is shaped very weirdly. I pulled this out of one of the, I think the Equifax book actually, where kind of shaped, looks like it's kind of shaped like a bagpipe or something like that. But if you look at it in 3D, the right ventricle is shaped quite differently than the left ventricle. And only through 3D reconstruction can we kind of see how this thing is so differently shaped, where you have the tricuspid and the pulmonic valves here and so on and so forth. You can see this is a totally different animal than the left ventricle, where the left ventricle is just a tube, and this thing is sort of like a bellows type thing, if you will. And the perfusion territories for the right side of the heart, again, we're talking anterior marginal and RCA, which is going to wrap around and go through the PDA and all that stuff. Right. Artery, primarily everything on the right side, right? And these are the breakdown of the coronary territories on the right side and how we identify the walls of the right side nomenclature, just like we have on the left side. On the right side, we have a wall nomenclature too. So if you look here, we have, for example, in the right ventricle, we're going to look just at the right ventricle here. And if you see, if we're looking at, for example, in the peristernal long axis view, what wall do we see of the RVOT in that view? And if you look at the shape, the markings on this right here and correspond those down over here to what wall we see over here, looks like this is probably going to be the anterior wall of the right ventricular outflow tract in that view there. And then if you go to, for example, the two-chamber view, we're going to be seeing the anterior wall of the RV and the inferior wall of the RV. And this is not Next slide, the two-chamber view. This is our inflow view, okay, which kind of looks like the two-chamber view of the LV. This is our tricuspid valve, our anterior and probably inferior leaflets here, or septal leaflet of tricuspid valve, depending on how you're angled. This is the anterior wall, and this is going to be a solid black, so that's going to be our inferior wall of the RV here. Then we go to a short axis view, we actually see three different walls of the RV. We see the anterior, lateral, and inferior wall of the RV in the short axis view. This is all supplied by the RCA. We know that, okay. And then if we go to our short axis view with the aortic valve, we see our RV up in this view here, and the walls we see there are going to be, again, anterior, and here you see the inferior wall of the RV. That's the cut we're making through there. Kind of an interesting cut there. And then if you do the four-chamber view of the heart and concentrate on the RV, we see over here, we see the lateral wall of the RV. And if we do our five-chamber, we still see the lateral wall of the RV. If we bring in our aortic valve in the five-chamber view, then we go to our sub, we see our inferior wall of the RV. So there are different nomenclatures for the right ventricle too. The right ventricle is sort of, we're paying more attention to the right ventricle these days, but in a lot of labs, they're still not paying much attention to the right ventricle. I can tell you this, in stress echo, the right ventricle isn't even considered. We'll talk about that later, but for the most part, stress echo is all about the left ventricle. But this, for test purposes, we should know these walls, okay? And get to know which wall we're looking at when we do our imaging for our echoes, not only for our LV walls, but for our RV walls also. And this just breaks it down which artery would supply the walls of that particular area of the RV. For example, if you're in the short axis view and you're looking at the pulmonary artery, RV outflow tract, you can see here this is RCA, conus branch is supplying this right here, and it's also going to be supplied by the acute marginal branch of the in this area of the RV. And if you're looking at the inflow view, like we identified before, anterior wall, inferior wall in the inflow view, and we have the anterior tricuspid valve and the posterior leaflet here of the tricuspid valve, the station valve down here. You can see up here we have the posterior descending artery supplying the inferior wall of the RV, which makes sense, and this purplish here, you can see the acute marginal branch supplying that. And then down in here we have just concentrate on the RV if you would, we have this purple here, and we can see that that is going to be the acute marginal branch, and this bluish is going to be LAD and through here. And you see a little red through here, the RCA conus branch down in here. So yeah, so the RV is supplied by different branches off the right coronary artery, as we can see here in all these other pictures. And what we see, as far as the RV is concerned, in our peristernal long axis view, we see this part of the RV right here. And as we noticed and identified before in the peristernal long axis view, we're seeing this wall right here, which is the, as we see down here, this is the anterior wall. The anterior wall of the right? No, we're seeing the, whichever one looks like the anterior wall of the RVOT, I'm sorry. The anterior wall of the right ventricular outflow tract right here. And this is just a little more detailed view of that particular area there and what you see in that particular view. I won't worry too much about that. We go into our short axis view. What part of the wall do we see in here? This is the RV. We know this is the aortic valve and so on and so forth. We're going to identify these RV walls right here. And in that particular view, we know we see the, excuse me, anterior wall of the RV and the inferior wall of the RV. So go back, anterior, inferior. It's a totally different animal. Apical 4, lateral wall of the RV. And if you go into the apical 4, this is the lateral wall of the RV. Right here. You can see it right there. And we go into the short axis view. Here's our RV that wraps around the LV here, and in the short axis view, we see all three different walls, right? We see the excuse me, the anterior wall of the RV. We see the lateral wall of the RV and the inferior wall of the RV. So if we go back to our short axis view, we can see those walls right here. Anterior, lateral, and inferior. Anterior, lateral, and inferior. And if we look at the two-chamber view, there are no associations for the RV in there, because if you look at the two-chamber view, it's all about the LV. Sounds like that could be a trick question on the test or something, right? Apical 3-chamber view, the long axis, we can actually see the RV over here in some situations, so but we don't show that on here either, right? If you look at our subcosta view, inferior wall of the RV, right? Inferior wall of the RV in the subcosta view here. So we're going to end it there, and that'll be the only video lecture for this class too. Okay. Thank you for your time.